Good morning, everyone. So let's move seamlessly now into our next session, which is about the EU and the New World Order. Frankly, from where I sit, it's more of a disorder, but let's talk about that. I'm Shada Islam. I'm Director for Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe, and it's my pleasure and my privilege to hold this conversation with Alexander Stubb. Now, all of us here know him. He's had several incarnations, Prime Minister of Finland, Foreign Minister, Europe Minister. He's been at the European Parliament. And in his current guise, he is Vice President at the European Investment Bank. So the rules of the game are very simple. Alexander, you'll take the floor for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'll ask you a few follow-up questions, and then I think we'll have time for about 2 questions from the floor. So, Alexander, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. It's wonderful to be here in one of my many incarnations. You said, as a matter of fact, I take tremendous pride in the fact that 18 years ago, in 1999, I started my career here in Brussels as the Deputy Antici during the Finnish presidency, serving information up to Coreper 2. And obviously, more importantly, I also worked in the predecessor and to your think tank, at the time called the Group of Policy Advisors in the European Commission for Romano Prodi. I always am happy to come also back to my old alma mater of sorts, the European Parliament, because I was here as an MEP 2004-2008. But most importantly, I'm glad that James Ellis just popped in, who is the father in many ways of ESPAS, together with Jim Claus, Klaus Welle, and many others who pushed through this interinstitutional strategic thinking, which I think we need probably more than ever before today. And I remember it was a long haul. It was an uphill battle. I mean, James kept on pushing it, Jim kept on pushing it, Klaus kept on pushing it, Anthony kept on pushing it, and here we are. And I looked at the roster, and I am certainly very impressed. As far as the European Investment Bank is concerned, can we agree on one thing, and that is that if I say something that sounds smart, intelligent, analytical, you give the credit to the European Investment Bank. If I say something stupid, please blame me. So I'm probably not here speaking in my capacity as VP at the European Investment Bank, but I cannot hesitate as an institutional nerd to give you an elevator pitch. The European Investment Bank is probably the best-kept secret in Europe. It is the biggest multilateral bank in the world. We're 10 times bigger than the EBRD. We're 3 times bigger than the World Bank. We are owned by you, the EU member states. We have assets 600 billion euros worth. We have capital 250 billion euros worth, and we give out financial instruments / loans of approximately 80 billion euros per annum. We are managing the Juncker plan, among many others, and we are leveraging European private money from anywhere up to 4 to 10-fold. I'll stop there, but it's a great institution. Look at it. You love it. I will make 3 points in my allotted 10 to 15 minutes today. One is linked to dates. The second one is linked to one particular date. And the third one is a suggestion of Europe's place in the New World Order. Now, Klaus Welle mentioned many good dates there, including 1968. He didn't mention that I was born on the 1st of April in 1968, which was obviously significant in and of itself. But I would argue that if we, as international relations experts and buffs, want to analyze the past, I'd say 90 to 100 years of foreign relations and the shift which Klaus was alluding to, I think that there are 3 key dates that we need to look at. Date number 1, I would argue, is 1945. Yes, we could have used 1918, but I would say it's still 1945. And why do I say this? Because, number 1, it was the end of World War II. Number 2, it was the creation of an ideological and bipolar world where our world, the West, was juxtaposed against another world, the East. It was the United States against the Soviet Union. It was free market capitalism, freedom and democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, against a communist/socialist system, totalitarian, authoritarian system of control. And finally, 1945, because that was the creation of the international institutions as we know them today, in their various formations. Obviously not exactly on 1945, but in the aftermath. NATO, WTO, the European Union through the coal and steel community, the United Nations, the IMF, the Bretton Woods system included, the EIB, of course, the World Bank, etc. That was the multilateral world that we knew. So 1945 was very much the end of a war era, at least a hot war era. It was the beginning of the international institutional systems as we know it, and it was the beginning of a bipolar world. The second date that I would flag as a major shift in international relations was actually 1989. And that was obviously the end of the Cold War, or at least the beginning of the end of the Cold War, with the downfall of the Berlin Wall, with the beginning of the process of reintegration between East and West, 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what at the time was the reaction of the European Union as we know it? It was to try to accommodate, absorb and integrate into a new system. It was a leap forward in the integration process through the Maastricht Treaty, a place which I will, by the way, be visiting this evening, giving a Jean Monnet lecture over there. It was the beginning of the enlargement process, the beginning of the Euro, the beginning of the European Union. It was also an era of hope, if you remember. Nelson Mandela is freed. Václav Havel roams in the streets of Europe. There's the Velvet Revolution. Fukuyama speaks of the end of history and the fact that all 200 nation states in this world will revert to liberal democracy and a social market economy. Little did we know at the time that that was probably not going to be the natural progression of things, but that was at least the feeling, the aim. And I belong to that category. I started studying in the United States in 1989, and I started studying international relations. And you can imagine as a young student to get into the midst of the theory and then suddenly see the Berlin Wall coming down. I mean, Carl Bildt was already almost prime minister by then, if not prime minister. So he's been around a little bit longer. But for me, this was an awakening, a tremendous awakening. And I've been able to live in a relative era of peace. It's been very easy to be an institutional nerd and an avid pro-European come federalist in this era, because everything has basically gone the way in which functionalists or neo-functionalists wanted to think that they would go. And for a small country like myself, which shares 1,300 kilometers of border of Russia, it's also been a tremendous time of prosperity to be able to truly integrate into the West, whether it's economically, politically, or in terms of a value base. And then we come to the third date, and that is obviously 2016. And on one hand, Brexit, and on the other hand, the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. For me, this has created, and I will come back to this in a second, a power vacuum in the world, because the United States is not anymore the undisputed superpower of this world. And I would argue that the United Kingdom is unfortunately voluntarily marginalizing itself from the world scene. And I would argue that this changes not only geopolitics and power in the West and in the world, but it also changes the constellation of the institutions that were founded in the post-World War II era, post-1945. So my first point is that three key dates for us internationalists, I think, have changed the world: 1945, 1989, and 2016. Many others could be mentioned, obviously, but for me, as a three-pointer, these would be the ones that I'd start with. Second point today is the consequences for us here in Europe on 2016. The first consequence, I would argue, is the demise of the Anglo-Saxon world. Brexit means exit. It means exit from the European Union, and therefore it means, unfortunately, and I say this as an avid Anglophile and someone whose rest of the family have dual nationality, British-Finnish, I think it means the demise of the United Kingdom on the world stage. Secondly, linked to this demise of the Anglo-Saxon world, America first means world second. If basically you're saying that you want to create walls, you want to increase protectionist measures, you want to withdraw from various international institutions and conflict, you cannot be the undisputed superpower of this world. So this leads me to conclude, unfortunately, that the world which was, the liberal world which was started to be created through academic theory in the 1700s with John Locke and with Montesquieu and many others, is somehow shaky at the moment. I might be over-exaggerating, I might be pushing the argument, but at least we're not in the same comfortable Western value base that we have been for the past 25 years. The second consequence of 2016 is unpredictability of world politics. And this obviously manifests itself in many different levels, not only in North Korea, Iran, or Syria, but it also manifests itself especially in the foreign policies of what we would call traditional democracies. I think democracy today, unfortunately, is a very messy business. We're getting in many elections very unclear results. And I'm not only talking about the Finnish elections in 2011 or the time it took for the Belgian government to set itself up or the political mayhem in the United States or the United Kingdom or the situation with the post-German election or the Dutch elections as such. But basically we're getting democracies which are not necessarily as stable in governance as they used to be. And this has, I would argue, a ramification also on world politics. I'll add to this, this sort of unpredictability of world politics, that we do seem to have a lot of testosterone floating around in foreign policy right now. I mean, the amount of macho leaders that we're seeing at this particular moment, some falling and some surviving, is unforeseen. One could argue, for instance, in the era of strong leadership, people like Putin, people like Erdogan, people like Trump, Duarte's, many other that have taken a rather unpredictable stance in foreign policy. And the final and third consequence of 2016, in my mind, is a power vacuum which has now been born in the world. The world order that we had during the Cold War obviously was quite clear. It was bipolar. In the post-Cold War, it was unipolar, and there was still a strong belief in international institutions, integration, and obviously the United States. But that is simply not the case anymore. And any time in foreign policy when a power vacuum emerges, someone is going to be there to fill it. And here is where I come to my third and final point before concluding. And that is the EU in this new order. I would argue that the EU needs to do at this particular moment in time three things. And I actually think that it is doing fairly well in this. We can always criticize, but I do think that it's working quite hard on these three fronts. The first one is to defend Western or European values. I argue strongly that the success of our societies is based on three things: liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. And the EU simply needs to defend these, not turn their back against it. Yes, there are some countries inside the European Union and their regimes which are doing precisely that, turning their back against the liberal world order or liberal internationalism and pushing rather illiberal values. But at least there seems to be a critical mass that pushes the positive agenda. The second thing the EU needs to do is to take the lead on two issues. One is trade, and the other one is climate change. And I think the European Union has done fairly well when it comes to climate change. COP23 was yet another example, and I think we should also give a lot of credit in COP23 to the private sector and the way in which it is trying to push that agenda beyond, for instance, what the United States is able to do right now. And trade, obviously, is another issue. We live and breed free trade. We should not be the ones driving protectionist policies. The third thing that the European Union needs to do in this situation is linked to at least the rhetoric of the current President of the United States, and that is to develop a European security and defense. And we are seeing leaps and bounds in this field at this particular moment. And I'm not only talking about structured cooperation, one of my favorite subjects linked to enhanced cooperation and flexible integration, which was pushed through, I think, last week with 23 member states, but also the Commission's initiative on a European Defence Fund, and actually also some, albeit minor, action coming from the European Investment Bank. So I think we need to start developing capacities in this area. So, ladies and gentlemen, by way of conclusion, I would say that 2016 established a new world order in which power vacuums need to be filled, and I think Europe can do that, especially on three accounts, one of them being values, the other one being trade and climate, the third one being security and defense. Secondly, I do think that we are in an era of insecurity, but it's always important in these eras to keep your head calm. The problem with today's information flow, obviously, is that people react very quickly and things can turn sour quite quickly. Just take a breather, count to 10, and then make your assessment. Finally, and I will not touch on this, but I'll throw it for the discussion, Anne mentioned it in her introduction, that a lot of people are now talking about the fourth industrial revolution. In other words, artificial intelligence, digitalization, robotization, 3D printing, Internet of Things. I fully agree. I've been studying the subject for the past 2 years. I think it's fascinating. It will change our economies, it will change our business models, it will change politics, it will change democracy, and it will also have implications on global politics. And if you really want to push it, I think it will also change Homo sapiens, human beings. But that's for another discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for taking us into our past and also all the dilemmas and the challenges we face today. I'm going to try and take you a little bit into the future. You mentioned the 3 dates, and if I mention to you October 2017 and the 19th Party Congress and the power and the clout that Xi Jinping has accumulated, and with the liberal democracies, Alexander, committing really harakiri in public, right? This is what we're doing. And China emerging as very self-confident, quite assertive, not just to its neighbors, but worldwide. How can the EU, with its values, hold back and preserve our values in the face of the China model, which is economic liberalization, but political control?
Well, as I said in my first part of what the EU should do, I think it is the time to defend and in many ways protect the values of liberal democracy, social market economy and globalization. And one could argue that what China is protecting right now is the notion of market economy, albeit with quite strong controlled and protectionist tendencies, and obviously globalization, because that is in their interest or in their vested interest. I've always believed in a dignified foreign policy, which means that through economic means and dialogue and showing that your values prevail, you can change societies. I've always been a little bit skeptical about, for instance, democracy by stealth or democracy by force, because I think that democratic institutions, they take a long time to be established. Now, you can always push the argument a little bit further and say that the instruments of modern communication and information technology will make it rather difficult for China to continue as a centralized system of total control. And I think we will see this develop over time. Final point on this, usually there seems to be a direct correlation between economic growth and stability, and then vice versa. So if you have an economic downturn, there's quite often political instability. And obviously in the Chinese case, since opening from the 1980s, we haven't seen many economic downturns. So as long as the machinery keeps on churning good economic results, I don't think China is going to change.
Thank you. Also, just want to talk to you about our biggest neighbor, Africa. Next week, we have the Europe-Africa Summit. And I've been taking part in quite a few discussions yesterday. That's why I couldn't come and to the ESPAS conference, because we were holding at Friends of Europe a discussion of an eminent group of people, Africans, young Africans, Europeans, on Africa. And there is so much passion in that argument that Africa is really Europe's future, that Africa could be the second China, and that we in Europe are really not paying the kind of attention that we should be paying. We're worried about migrants, great, but we're not doing what is really needed to make sure that Africa develops and grows and gives jobs to its many, many young people.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And I'd give two answers to that. One is the reverse to your previous question. I wrote a column in the Financial Times about a year ago, the title of which was rather provocative. It was that Europe is the new Africa for China. And with that, I meant that the way in which the Chinese explored and exploited and used raw materials in Africa, they are doing the same thing with less raw materials, in other words, intellectual properties and European companies. We've seen that in many mergers and acquisitions or outright hostile acquisitions and attempts over the past few years. So we need to look at that perspective. That's answer number one. So look first at what China is doing to Europe before you look at what Europe is doing to Africa. Then what Europe is doing to Africa, I do agree with you. Unfortunately, there are countries inside the European Union which come with colonial baggage and luggage, which makes, I think, relations quite complicated at times. There are nations which understandably come also with vested economic interest. I personally think, obviously, that Africa is the new China. How long that is going to take, I don't know. But the technological revolution, fourth industrial revolution, and the fact that everyone will at a certain time have smartphones, etc., gives a lot of opportunity. But the big risk factor that I see in all of this is actually climate change, and what that will do then to the capacity of Africa to grow as a continent. Final point on this, and I know I'm just touching the surface and in that sense being quite unfair, But I do think that in Europe we need to start moving away from traditional international grant-based subsidies and instruments more towards financial instruments with leverage. And here is the European investment banker speaking, right? I think the time of international socialism, for lack of a better term, is over, and we need to start thinking about microfinancing and different types of financing instruments, I think, in Africa as well, to look at them more as an equal partner and a business partner rather than a source of development aid. And I am not, please do not misunderstand, trying to say that development aid should be stopped. No, it should continue.
For sure. I think the private sector was highlighted over and over again yesterday. Let me just open the floor. I think we have time for 2 questions from the floor. So please just raise your hand and identify yourself. And yes, already 2 questions. Great. First the gentleman and then Heather. The lady, Heather. Please. I think we're getting a microphone to you. It's a question, right? Great.
Thank you very much. Just a brief question.
Identify yourself. Sorry, I don't know you.
My name is Norbert Ries. I'm coming from the Federal Academy for Security Policy in Berlin. Brief question concerning what you pointed out as the liberal world is somehow shaken. I would like to know what, is there a need for a sound debate on liberalism in the world of individual empowerment and failing social cohesion? What does it mean in the 21st century, the enigmatic word, liberalism? Thank you.
Yeah, I think probably there is a need for that debate. Unfortunately, when we start that debate on isms, there always be a lot of misunderstandings, because not all of us are academics who study the terminology, and then suddenly it becomes a very strong sort of ideological debate, liberal versus conservative, or socialist versus capitalist, or whatever you want to call it. But I would still argue that if you look at Europe by and large, this is the embodiment or the symbol of liberal internationalism. It's a system which is based on international law, on international institutions, and economic liberalism in the sense that we have the four freedoms. At the same time, it is based on nation states, which are strong welfare states, which promote social security, healthcare, education, etc. So this, for me, is by and large the liberal world. The big worry that I have, and we talked about it with Jim Claus here right before, and I actually wrote a column in Dagens Industri today about it. What I worry most about the future democracy and the liberal world is the way in which information technology influences it, in both good and bad. Good in the sense that it liberates people to express opinions, Maidan Square, the Arab Spring, and then good conversations in politics as well. I mean, I love to be on Twitter because no journalist can interfere or interpret what I say. They can do it later, but not before. But at the same time, that same instrument is leading to a lot of misinformation, to a lot of trolling, to algorithms which are not pushing the right news, at least from a liberal perspective. So what worries me is in this sort of transition of the fourth industrial revolution is that democracy will be undermined and it will be virtually impossible to govern in any European country, for example. I mean, yes, you can do it in France because you have a presidential system, but you look at the governance of the UK right now, or you look at the governance of, for instance, Finland when we had a six-party coalition. It's very difficult to do in this era. So that's the liberal word that I'd like to preserve.
It's true, Alexander, what you say, the EU is a symbol of liberalism. When you travel across the world, you do hear that. But I just wonder to what extent that can be true, remain true, if we're not practicing what we preach inside.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. There are countries in the European Union right now, which have illiberal governments and illiberal behavior as well. And that is why we have institutions and laws which at the end of the day should stand above the political behavior of these nation states. That's why we have clauses on I think Article 7, issues linked to human rights, and also the applicability and the way in which you implement European laws and values. And when the Commission goes down and starts posing question to a country which is pushing laws which are not in line of European values, I think they're doing the right thing.
And the world is watching, which brings me nicely to Heather Graby. Yes.
Thanks. Heather Graby from the Open Society European Policy Institute. So if the EU remains a beacon of liberalism, despite problems at home and so on, how much does it matter that the United States is no longer playing that role, at least as far as the emanations from the White House are concerned? You, Alex, you're well known as one of the great Nordic pro-Europeans and one of the great Nordic transatlanticists. So how much is it really affecting things? Do you think that this is a specific challenge for the EU in promoting something that is looking more specifically European rather than broadly Western? Is it an opportunity where we should step up and do more, or is it something where we should be a little bit more modest and cautious?
And just one more thing. Is this transition, is it a blip? Is Trump a blip? Or is this a real structural change in what's happening? US policies.
Yeah. Heather, thank you for the definition of Nordic pro-European, Nordic transatlanticist. I am, but I'm also a Nordic pragmatic, which basically means that, I use the wisdom of one of our former presidents called Paasikivi, that the beginning of all intelligence is to admit truths and facts. And I do that. And the fact is that the United States, at least for these remaining 3 years of the presidency, or a total of 7 years, will be marginalizing itself from the world stage. And then I think it's time for Europe to try to step in. Fortunately, right now for Europe, we are in an economically fairly comfortable moment. This can change very rapidly, and then again we can get into a crisis mode. But we at least have an opportunity to become a little bit more independent. Do I think this is a good thing? Well, it's got good sides and bad sides. The unfortunate thing in this dichotomy of 2016 is that one thing, namely Brexit, is permanent. Although, the jury is still out on that as well. I don't make predictions. But one thing is not permanent, and that's Donald Trump. So, in that sense, a blip might be a wrong word. And we should also distinguish in the United States between rhetoric and reality, because the rhetoric obviously is very strong, but we need to look at the reality, what the US does on the ground. And in many foreign policy issues, the line hasn't changed. Actually, they have become a little bit more active in comparison to what they were in the previous administration. But of course, on many things, they have been disengaged as well. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Yes, and as we all know, cities are stepping in where the federal government is stepping back.
Yeah, and I wonder, should we be worried about that or not? I mean, we've had a world of city-states at some stage. Of course, the information is there. But I'm starting to see a lot of cities trying to behave like little nation-states already. And, there's an interesting element of sort of tension there as well.
And you said, and I'm going to end on this, you said Europe can step in and change things. I have to say I was proud of being European. On the question of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, Federica Mogherini was in Bangladesh, was in Myanmar talking about these issues just last week. Trump didn't even mention it through his tour in Asia. So I think in that sense there are signals, signs that we are actually doing what we say we can do. So
yeah, definitely. And I think that's why, sometimes, especially us here in the Brussels bubble or Luxembourg bubble or wherever we're bubbling around, we need to be a little bit more sort of self-confident in what Europe is doing and what Europe has done. And I'm not standing here as a European federalist and sort of waving the flag and say we're all great and fantastic. But sit down and reflect sometimes. Just have a look at the system that we created. I mean, it's bloody marvelous with all of its defaults. And we're still the richest continent on the earth, and we have lived in relative peace for the past 70 years. So, be a little bit self-congratulatory at times instead of just looking at the negative sides. A final point, I am less worried about city-states in democracy than I am about huge information technology giants which are behaving as if they were states and even wanting to sit on P5 in the UN.
Okay, Alex, I think we have to bring this to an end. I could keep talking to you and asking questions, and I'm sure there are many, many questions out there as well, but we have a time schedule that we have to stick to. So thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much indeed for asking me to host this conversation. Thank you.